a novel from 1974, and a player autobiography from 2005. So there is at least a diversity of genre, together with a broad chronological sweep. So between them, these three texts also reveal, I hope, the evolving representation of elite rugby players in France, from local heroes to national stars to global icons, without those categories ever being mutually exclusive. My aim is to touch on some of the ways in which sporting identities traditionally based on local rootedness may now be evolving as expressions of new varieties of affiliation, mobility, and connectivity, both personal and professional. So I'm going to present three texts. Paul Voivenel's Le Match Droit from 1914. That wasn't actually the original title, a match report from 1914, which was actually picked up and then reworked and specifically included in two editions of his quite well-known book, Mon Beau Rugby, L'Esprit du Sport, which is a collection of his journalism, plus a selection of essays, which he accompanies it with. You'll notice the place of publication in Toulouse, which is the real sort of heart, if you like, of French rugby right down in the southwest. And particularly you'll note that it's Midi Olympique editions, that's to say the editions of the what has been since 1929 and is certainly still today the Bible of French rugby, the main newspaper. You'll also notice the date there in 1942. This was something which was published initially under the Vichy regime, and that's significant in the story, and I'll touch on that as we work through. Then I've got a novel from Kléber Edens, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, his novel Adios, which was from 1974. It actually won the Grand Prix of the French Academy that year, so it's something which is very critically regarded as a substantial piece of writing. It's quite a chunky novel, but it opens actually with a rugby-related incident, which we'll look at together. And then I've taken an extract from what's described as an autobiography, but it's actually a kind of co-production really between Abdelatif Benazzi and Richard Escaut. Benazzi will probably need not too much of an introduction as a rugby player. Escaut, a specialist rugby writer and journalist. And this is the third of a series of autobiographies written by, well, a number of people who I'll come back to, but featuring Abdelatif Benazzi. So I'm going to look at all three of those. By way of introduction, I might just note that rugby remains an intriguing sport in France for a number of reasons, really. Perhaps, first of all, is the most striking exception to the game's historical pattern of British imperial diffusion. For its distinctive geographical implantation and varied social assimilation, from patriotic and patrician pioneers in Paris, and particularly in the Parisian elite lycée, to its abiding cultural centrality in the deep southwest of the country. And for that move for values, there's perhaps no better indicator perhaps than the fact that Pierre de Coubertin, celebrated reviver of the Olympic Games, was the referee of the first rugby final in France. And the move between his sports association's idea of ludus pro patria, the game for the homeland, if you like, and what became very firmly French rugby's real motto of ludus pro loco, actually the game for the place, the particular locality, is part of that important story of how the game developed. So the game is characteristic for this, as I say, this adoption and then assimilation and then transformation in France. It's also, as part of that process, significant for its development of a distinctive and widely admired approach to attacking play, and also for its almost equally decried tolerance of violence and its cavalier disregard for the official amateurism of the game prior to the advent of professionalism in 1995. Most recently, I would suggest France's striking as a case study of the game's radical transformation in the quarter century since the onset of the professional era. So the game offers a complex historical narrative even before we look at its cultural representations, literary and other, at the local, regional, national and international levels. In addition, we must of course remember that all such sporting narratives are inherently constructed, if not actually confected, as Gary Wannell helpfully reminds us. And I've just got a quotation from him which focuses on this process of creating icons in the sporting media, of mythologizing. And he talks, in fact, about two rather contrary processes can be detected in these processes of narrativization, mythologization and reinscription. And it's primarily reinscription which interests me this evening. And I think this is a useful way of thinking about it, by reinscription he means the process whereby star biographies are constantly rewritten in the continuous present. Their lives are interpreted according to dominant concerns at the time of writing. Iconic status is always conferred in retrospect and constantly reinscribed in accordance with dominant discursive patterns of specific moments. So with that in mind, we can go on to look at our first example, which concerns the Aviron Bayonnais side. As part of French rugby's move from Paris initially and then down to Bordeaux, which became the next centre for the game's diffusion and strength, the move into the greater southwest, Toulouse as an important centre, but also in in Bayonne, right down the Spanish border, became a major centre for the game. And with Toulouse winning, Stade Toulousain, the famous side, winning the French championship for the first time in 1912, they were followed the following year by Bayonne, who became champions of France with a combination of power and artistry, really, which was widely approved or widely appreciated and referred to subsequently as la manière bayonnaise. It's at least in part due to the influence of a Welsh player and also trainer, Owen Rowe, who, haven't got time really to go into too much of that, but even at that very early stage, you've got a pattern of professional migration, professional movement, or what was effectively professional. I mean, there were jobs which, if you like, which were went with supposedly amateur roles in the game. So right from its very, very earliest days. So right from its most early days. So what I'm going to focus on today is very briefly, is a short extract, I hope it's not too long, from an article from 1914. This was the Bayonne versus Perpignan quarter-final of the French Championship. So it's journalism, but it's in a very consciously literary style, which is not unusual in French reporting, and particularly focusing on the character of these two teams, Bayonne from the Basque Country and Perpignan from the Catalan side of the Franco-Spanish border. So the both of them, if you like, in that kind of zone between France and Spain. Two races clashed, Basques and Catalans, but both teams contained athletes who were from outside these lands had not the slightest importance, for these outsiders were embraced and incorporated, digested as it were, and had quickly become part of the collective soul. Basques and Catalans, you know all the sporting poetry that's already attached those two names. Now, I don't need to go into all of the details, you can read through with me, but basically there's a focus on an ethnic identity, an identity which is rooted in the soil, which is talked about at some length. I've just given a compressed version of it there, and which is consciously literary in representation. There's a reference to Pierre Loti's novel Ramuncho, for example, about a smuggler in that borderland, and these particular descriptions of these two varieties of presumably ethnic types, but also of their particular rootedness in the soil of these contrasting but also complementary regions, Basques and Catalans. Now, there are a number of things which we might say about it. I mean, whether or not you like the style, what's striking is that this ethnically inflected Southwest has echoes of, amongst other things, sacralized Lorraine of Maurice Barrès and fellow right-wing literary defenders of the patrie. This interweaving of sport-inflected concepts of race and place tapped directly into what was a belligerent nationalism that preceded and informed the Great War. 3 decades later, the same ideas would be adopted by the reactionary Old Guard that sought to impose an authoritarian new order on a defeated French nation under the collaborationist Vichy regime. Voivenel himself, and also a Perpignan fly half of the 1920s, Joseph Pascal, who went on to become Minister of Sport, would be at the heart of such developments in the sporting sphere. Moreover, this particular match would lend itself uniquely well to such reinscription and the ideological appropriation that it made possible, in that no fewer than 15 of the 30 players who appeared on the pitch that day were to die in the 1914-18 conflict. Now I'm going to jump forward. I could talk quite a bit more about Vichy and its contribution really to actually the post-war flowering of the French game. The sporting sphere is often described as one in which there is an épuration introuvable, in that actually there was remarkable continuity between the wartime period and Vichy's significant investment in organised sport and what happened, and particularly how French rugby was able to succeed after World War II. But if we just sort of jump forward to the idea of how that success took place, in the next text that I'd like to look at, Kléber Aidance shares the provincial nostalgia that underpins Wavnel's revisiting of the narrative of patriotic self-sacrifice in 1942, having initially written about the match in 1914, combining it with an equally heartfelt proclamation of French rugby's distinctive contribution to the international sporting scene after the Second World War. The central figures in this narrative are two brothers who epitomised the French tradition of what would be called rugby champagne, André and Guy Boniface, willingly aided and abetted by the mercurial Jean Gachassin. Aidance was a former member of the right-wing Action Française movement in the 1930s, going on to join the similarly minded Hussard group of novelists who conceived themselves as the antithesis to the prevailing orthodoxy of left-wing intellectual commitment in the post-war period. Adios, as I think I already mentioned, won the 1974 Grand Prix de l'Académie Française and opens with an accurate account of what was at the time an enormous French sporting disappointment. Victory in the 1966 championship decider at Cardiff Arms Park would have ensured France's first Grand Slam. However, for Aidance's narrator, a sports journalist sent to report on the game, the outcome of the match is evidence of an essential component of the French national character. Rather than seeking, as a great majority of sides would have done, simply to defend the 2-point advantage over their adversaries that would surely have ensured victory, and against all expectations, the French three-quarters opted to attack. So we picked the story up. Our team was in an attacking mood. A movement by the three-quarter line, instantly illuminated by a deep break by the fly half, Gachassin, gave us a glimpse of a finale marked by flag waving and fanfares. Okay, the Welsh crowd is described. The ball sailed up into the grey sky in a very high pass, lofted pass, intended for the centre three-quarters running towards the Welsh goal line, flanked by our left winger. It was then that a strapping lad in a red jersey leapt up to seize the ball and, clasping it to his chest with his right hand, set off on a weaving 80-yard dash over the lush grass and against the wind. At the end of his sprint, there was the try that gave Wales the victory by a single point. It was over. So the intervention by Stuart Watkins is something to be noted, of course. It is something which has remained celebrated in Welsh sporting history as well as in French. But what's primarily of note here is the way that the French Rugby Federation actually responded to this snatching of defeat from the jaws of victory. I'm not talking about in the novel, I'm talking about in fact. Because the Gachassin and the Boniface brothers were dropped from the national team because of this incident. In spite of their record of achievement over the previous decade, the trio were dismissed without a word of explanation. This end to a rugby era would in turn be followed by a tragedy when Guy Boniface was killed in a car crash in the early hours of New Year's Day 1968. Jean Gachassin, whose misjudged pass has almost certainly cost France a Grand Slam in 1966, remained in no doubt about the significance of that day in Cardiff. In his 1969 autobiography, he stated, "Not to have gone for the gap that opened up would have been to deny rugby itself, our attacking variety of rugby, the eternal French rugby, which belongs to the past, the present, and the future." We're not so far away from Wavnel and perhaps from some other writers there as well, obviously, as Aidance. This stirring statement of France's sporting mission leads us to Abdelatif Benazzi, whose career successfully negotiated the game's shift to professionalism, as well as his own migration from his native Morocco and his naturalization as a French citizen. Benazzi won 78 international caps between 1990 and 2001, most notably as captain of the 1997 side that won France's first Grand Slam in a decade, a full year before French football's celebrated Black Blanc Beurre triumph, that's to say Black White Arab triumph in the FIFA World Cup 1998. For his part, Benazzi also made important contributions to the French cause in 3 Rugby World Cups, 1991, 1995 and 1999, while his personal itinerary mirrored rugby's broader evolution in a globalised sporting landscape, providing a doubly valuable template for the game's French games developing openness both to imported talent and to more socially inclusive structures of player recruitment. Above all, it was Benazzi's extraordinary visibility as a North African and a Muslim in this most traditional of team games that was most remarked upon by media commentators in France and abroad, and which was ultimately to shape the player's portrayal both on and off the pitch. The extract highlighted here relates to the 1991-1992 season, undoubtedly Benazzi's annus horribilis, when he broke his arm on 2 occasions, then following a lengthy recuperation, was sent off in a club match against Toulon, which resulted in a 4-match ban for both his club Agen and the national side, leading in turn to his dropping from the French party for its summer tour of Argentina. Benazzi's expulsion was prompted by racist insults from his former international teammate, Eric Champ, who was also sent off for his part in the ensuing brawl. At a particularly low ebb, Benazzi returned to Morocco, where, accompanied by one of his brothers and 2 cousins, he embarked for the first time on an expedition deep into the mountain and desert landscapes of the Moroccan south. It was as the guest of a Berber shepherd that the future star was invited to reflect on the insignificance of rugby's vagaries in the face of more fundamental questions of being and belief. This episode is recounted in all 3 of his published biographies, Galder in 1995, De La Salle in 2000, and the one that we're looking at here, Benazzi and Esco 2005, which you can perhaps see on the right there, includes a preface by no less than Nelson Mandela. So this final iteration of the story is the one highlighted here, in which Benazzi speaks in his own voice or something close to it, and is this first-person narration that most tellingly evokes his reaction to the desert nomad's response to his own sporting mobility and in turn to his adopted French citizenship. So we were sitting between the East and the West, which brought me back to the fact that I was living at the crossroads of different societies. He gave me the strength to believe that the mixing of civilizations is inescapable. It requires many sacrifices and a good deal of suffering, but things cannot be otherwise. I'm jumping on a little bit, I'm compressing it rather, but he's thinking about the teams, he's thinking about these teams that he's been part of and that he's sort of joined. So we were rugby, whatever country we came from. Then he's reflecting on his experience of international matches, and he says, over the course of the matches, I understood the real meaning of this anthem. To sing La Marseillaise while wearing the blue jersey and representing France is not an ordinary act. Each word, each sentence of the anthem takes you back to the history of France, to the defense of the ideals of the French Revolution, to the idea of national sovereignty in the face of the invader. And you'll be familiar with the words, I'm sure. Now, interestingly, I always thought of my parents back in Morocco when I was singing it, but from that moment onwards, it would carry a new weight. Through it, I felt the privilege that was mine to represent a country which was so iconic as France. So we're far removed here from both the themes and the tonality of the average player biography. Clearly, the trope of the desert encounter may well contribute to the narrative's mythologization of its subject. However, this reinscription of Benazzi's self-reflection, not only within his professional itinerary, but also within the societal configuration of France in the 1990s and 2000s, and this book came out in 2005, which people will remember, particularly for the difficult summer which was experienced in the high-density suburbs, La Banlieue. You know, 2005 was, if you like, one of the hottest of the summers from that point of view in terms of social conflict in those high density suburbs. So for him to, as I say, reinscribe his experience within the societal configuration of France at that time serves to ensure its broader relevance and resonance. In turn, Benazzi's expression of pride in his adopted national anthem illuminates a broader faith in the French Republican value system, specifically in the face of the multiple challenges experienced by the star himself, together with a multicultural France, of which he had become the honoured sporting representative. So, winding up, while it may often be true, as Jean Giraudoux famously remarked in 1928, that une vie sportive est une vie héroïque à vide, that's to say that a sporting life is a heroic life, but a heroic life lived in a vacuum. Such an itinerary as that of Abdelatif Benazzi does suggest that a minority of sports stars may be able to mobilize their media representation so as to engage authentically and productively with underlying social-cultural questions. It's thus Abdelatif Benazzi's embodiment of transnational hybridity, his in-between status as both Moroccan and Frenchman, man of faith and citizen of the Republic, sportsman and social reformer, that emerges as the abiding legacy of his multiply narrated sporting life. By way of a conclusion, if I may, and I think I'm up to the 20 minutes, just a concluding image. This, obviously, the line is from the Marseillaise, aux Armes Citoyens, and the image is from France against South Africa in the Rugby World Cup 1995. You can see François Pinard, who would go on to become the triumphant captain of the South African side, and who would be presented famously by Nelson Mandela with the trophy at Ellis Park in Johannesburg, with Mandela wearing a Springboks jersey in a wonderfully iconic incarnation or representation of the Rainbow Nation and of South African democracy. But Benazzi very, very nearly scored a try in the downpour of Durban on that day, and it's sometimes said that if his fingers of his arms had been 1 inch longer, he would have scored. So that if that's the case, then François Pinard, with his own Huguenot background, that French hook part of South Africa, which eventually blended into the Afrikaner identity, he might not have actually had that opportunity to receive the cup at that time, and in that very, very special way from Nelson Mandela. I'm not so sure if Mandela would have been up for writing the preface for Benazzi's autobiography if that had happened, but I'm sure he would have done. But thank you very much for listening, and I hope that wasn't over long. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Okay, great. We have time for a couple of questions before we move on to our next speaker. Nobody's posted anything in the chat. Has anyone got any questions for Phil? Well, perhaps while I'm waiting for people to post questions, I'll ask one myself. I just wanted to sort of come back to some of the biographies about Benazzi that you didn't have time to talk about.
Yes.
And to the idea from Wanel about star biographies as being a constant reinscription. What did those earlier biographies tell us? What was their focus? What kind of preoccupations and discourse?
It's very, very interesting, because I mean it's interesting. There's an obvious shift in terms of the publishers as well, in terms of a sort of literary respectability, because they go from initially. I mean, they're very obviously. The first one is straightforwardly a biography, and it's kind of done in a sort of bon enfant way, where there's actually a fairly straightforward kind of paternalistic and not infrequently racist agenda, which is saying that he's come to the country and been accepted and sort of moved into, if you like, this culture and these traditions in the southwest of France. And in spite of a bit of, what's played down on the whole is the huge pressures that he was put under, both in Cahors, which was his first club, and then in Agen, where Benazzi actually faced very, very significant racism, both from players and supporters. So that actually, that is in the initial biography is played down considerably. It's very much the voice of the kind of authoritative and sort of avuncular style, if you like, of the author, which comes through. And actually Benazzi been able to talk about the really challenging nature of those difficulties, of that experience, doesn't come through at all. It's that there's a shift, particularly in that representation of how he had to struggle, both as a player, because it wasn't obviously the case that he would be, a success in the French game, and he was certainly, if you like, leading the way for others, but also in terms of the way in which he's struggling for a voice too. So there's more of him in the second version, in the Solar one, and most of all in what's quite a serious treatment of Richard Esco in the third. So there's kind of more of him as they move through the different volumes, and there's one every 5 years, which is quite striking. And there's also more of him, more of his voice, but also a greater engagement with what was genuinely difficult experience of France, in particularly the hostility which he faced early on.
Great, thank you. We've now got two further questions, one from Sean, one from Alan. I think I'm going to keep Alan's for the end so that we stick to time, and just hand over to Sean. So sorry about that, Alan, but I will come back to you at the end. Okay, so Sean.
Oh, thanks, Martin, and thanks particularly Phil. Fascinating paper. Good to see you. I just had I was intrigued by the preface by Mandela and what he had to say. I mean, given Mandela's symbolic role and his very prominent role with regard to '95 World Cup and the symbolism around racial relations that were associated with that, how did he kind of position the autobiography?
I think there's certainly an appreciation of sport, and a sport as a mechanism for bringing people together in spite of everything, if you like, in spite of conflicts of various kinds. And there's a link as well with his own experience, particularly in Robben Island, with the Robben Island Rugby Club, where people, the games were organised, but also that it was one of the ways in which they would actually relate quite positively with guards inside the prison was through the game. So even in that toughest of circumstances, the game could offer something. I mean, for me, I don't want to go overboard, but Mandela's reaction, the preface is a genuine appreciation, I think, of Benazzi's own significance, and it is something which has been interesting as well as the way in which Benazzi was received in South Africa, and the way in which he was looked upon. Including, I know, the visits to townships and so on is part of the kind of organised and corporate, really nowadays, sorts of activities that visiting rugby teams will be engaged with. But there was something a bit more authentic about it in the case of Benazzi. There's some fascinating work which has been done too about the way in which rugby is evolving, particularly in the Parisian suburbs. Some of the biggest clubs in France now, actually, in terms of membership, are actually located not at all where you would expect to find them, and not at all in cultural heartland. So both in France itself, but also I think in this particular case, this kind of very, very special recognition of Benazzi's importance. He is somebody who has been perceived as a figure with a global significance and an exemplary value as well as at home.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Alan's posted a question for you in the chat, which you can have a think about and we'll get back to at the end. So you should have a really stunning answer to this one.
I'll do my best.
Right. So thanks again, Phil. Virtual round of applause. And we'll move on to our second presenter, Jonathan. So Jonathan, if you'd like to unmute yourself. Jonathan Ervine is Senior Lecturer in French and Francophone Studies at Bangor University and has published research about French cinema, humour, music and sport. His work on French sport has examined questions surrounding sport, media and national identity, particularly in relation to football. He's also authored several publications on sports, video games, and is currently writing a book chapter about anti-Semitism and French football. And his paper tonight is titled Visions of Sport, Rural Life and Nostalgia in French Film. Over to you, Jonathan.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Martin, and thanks to everyone involved with organising this series of seminars. I'm just going to try to share the screen, and I hope my PowerPoint slides are now visible. Is that slides coming and audio coming across?
Yeah, that's fine, Jonathan. Yeah, you can see that.
Great. Okay, thank you. So, just starting point, just like to say thanks again to the organisers, because the current picture on the slides represents the closest I got to attending a proper sports venue since COVID, since March, basically. So it's great to be able to participate in this series of seminars and come together to discuss sport at a time when it's not as easy as it normally is to attend sports matches. So the title of the paper I'm going to present today is called Visions of Sport, Rural Life and Nostalgia in French Film. So maybe continuing in some respects with some of the strands to do with French sport and identity that Phil touched upon in his paper. So France is a very significant country when you look at both sport and cinema. It's a country that played a massive role in establishing cinema as an art form and creating both the modern Olympics and football's World Cup. Now, Sean Crossan, who we've heard from already tonight in the Q&A just a few minutes ago, rightly notes in his book about sports film that, and I quote, modern sport and cinema both emerged contemporaneously towards the end of the 19th century. I wholeheartedly agree with this, and at the same time, what I think is notable about French cinema in general, particularly in the sound era, is that it maybe doesn't quite focus on sport quite as much as one might expect. Nevertheless, I'm going to set out to analyse the visions of sport, rural life and nostalgia that are evident in two films that were made in the last decade. First of all, Philippe Guillard's 2011 film, Le Fils à Joe, which is known in English as, I think, Joe's Boy, literally means the son of Joe, refers to the central character and his father that we see in the slide on the left. I'm also going to talk about Thomas Soriot's 2016 film La Dream Team, officially known in English as A Mighty Team. So the first of these films, Le Fils à Joe, is set in the southwest of France and is in a sort of type of rugby playing heartland that Phil mentioned in his talk. Then I'm also, what I'm going to touch upon in talking about La Dream Team is football, soccer, association football, which is located in central France. And both of them appeal to some similar sentiments to do with tradition, nostalgia, and family values, I'll argue. Quite a few of the ways these films feature some recognizable tropes of the sports film genre via notably the attention that they devote to plucky underdogs. Now, to return to something that Sean Crossan mentions in his book in Sport and Film, he says that Hollywood films, sports films, generally, and I quote, are centrally concerned with affirming the meritocracy myth of the American dream while maintaining patriarchal hegemony. Now, despite ways in which both of the main films I'm going to discuss here tonight provide an at times cliched representation of sport, and I think a somewhat problematic depiction of race and diversity in France, I can argue that they also need to be placed within the context of evolving and increasingly diverse representations of masculinity in French sports films over the last decade. So to begin with, I'm going to focus on Le Fils à Joe and how it represents rugby and a certain type of community in the southwest of France. It's a fictional film from 2011 that focuses on a father-son relationship between a former rugby player a fictional former rugby player who reaches the fringes of the French national rugby team, and his son who plays the sport but is a bit less enthusiastic. We see a focus on rugby as a symbol of rural village tradition in southwest France. This is established near the start by a series of shots of black and white photos of teams in rugby clubhouse that are accompanied by a voiceover that provides the perspective of 13-year-old Tom, the son of Joe. And this is what Tom says. In my family, for 100 years, rugby has been more than a religion. It's a family duty, an obligation. Great-grandfather, grandfather, uncle, great-uncle, all the Cannavaros have been great rugby players and even internationals. My father, who is the iconic fly half of RC Dumiac, always proudly says, the Cannavaros are a trademark and woe betide anyone who breaks the mold. My father is him, Joe Cannavaro. And at this moment, we see a picture of Tom's father, Joe, this local hero, if you like, former rugby player in France International. Now, the last line of this quote links in some ways to what we see in the following scene, which raises the prospect that Tom is indeed going to be the member of the Cannavaro family or dynasty, if you like, that will end up breaking the mold by failing to establish himself as a talented rugby player. In our first rugby match that we see in the film. We see Tom knock the ball forward immediately after the kickoff in a local match. And later in the same game, his team concedes a try after he misses a tackle, seemingly ducking out of a physical confrontation. Tom receives little sympathy from his father, Joe, after the game, who appears to see his son's performance as a stain on the reputation of the Cannavaro family. It's quite unsympathetic. He says to him, "How are you going to play rugby if you can't tackle? People dream of being like the All Blacks. You know what it's like in New Zealand? There are two sorts of guys, rugby players and sheep. Right now, you'd be more used for making woolen jumpers." After the same game, we see Joe, Tom's father, become embroiled in a post-match fight with opposing fans. And he follows up this tirade by accusing Tom of behaving like a little girl as he walks away crying. Although this sort of beginning to the film firmly establishes a largely stereotypical vision of masculinity that's centered on a macho rugby culture, the film progressively exposes a more sensitive side to Joe. We recently learned that he became a widower a year after Tom's birth when his wife died in a car accident, and that he has struggled to establish a sense of purpose since the end of his playing days and has large debts. However, it's also a film where we see Joe progressively develop a sense of purpose in his life and make the transition from being a somewhat disengaged father to being a more involved father. As we've seen in several other French sports films from the last decade, sport plays a key role in a sort of renewed family bonding. In the scenario that is in some ways perhaps reminiscent of Bill Forsyth's 1983 Scottish comedy Local Hero, a key element of the plot of Le Fils à Joe comes when Joe discovers this sort of renewed sense of purpose as he seeks to prevent the field in which the Cannavaros have played rugby for a century being built on by a timber firm that's bought the site. Initially, the intensification of this focus on rugby, which sees him creating a new team after Tom's told he's not good enough to play for Hurcombe, Joe's former club, this appears to involve Joe reverting to type and just kind of continuing to be focusing on rugby, and nothing else. However, it ultimately leads to him taking a step back from rugby and becoming more involved in his role as a father and almost an educator in some respects. He reignites friendships with former teammates who help him to run the team, one of whom has returned to the area after 15 years in New Zealand and invites, in fact, a New Zealander to coach Joe's team. The fact that the New Zealander in question is called Jonah reinforces the idea that there's a new Joe in town, if you like, and also the notion that Tom now has a new male role model. And this is reinforced when we see him wearing a famous all black rugby top in training. Joe's transition in the film is quite stark when it comes to his attitude to Tom's schooling. Near the beginning, we see Joe tell Tom that securing excellent marks in maths and French isn't going to get him anywhere in life and that he needs to remember a Cannavaro. Joe says this whilst driving his work van on which we see the slogan, "Masonry is a career." The world of education is, however, something which Joe seeks to exploit for the benefit of his new rugby team. He meets up with a former teammate called Robert Cahuzac, who is now a somewhat unconventional head of year at a local secondary school. Cahuzac uses his role to recruit talented players who are underperforming at his school by promising that he'll ensure that they successfully progress into the next year of school if they join Joe's rugby team. Nevertheless, Joe feels that Tom will learn key lessons on a rugby field rather than in the classroom, and states at one stage, "Teachers are like referees. The less I see them, the better." However, we do see in the film later on Joe appearing to attend a parents' evening for what seems to be the first time ever, and he later tries to encourage Tom that there is, in fact, more to life than rugby. Now, another key development in the plot concerns the person that we see on the left on the slide that I've just moved to. Joe becomes attracted to Alice Hamilton, an Irish woman who has moved to the Dumiac area in the south of France. Well, I should say Dumiac is actually a fictional village, though clearly located in the southwest of France. Alice Hamilton is the person who is the boss of the timber firm that intends to build on the Cannavaro's rugby field. Alice's arrival in the area stems from a sense of family duty as she took over the company following the death of her father and appears motivated by similar factors to Joe. In other words, a sort of pursuing or continuing a sort of family legacy in this part of France that means something to her family as well, because her family is part French, even though she's Irish. So what ultimately happens is that she discovers how much rugby means to Joe in the village and decides that her company will not build on the Cannavaro's century-old pitch. Joe and Tom repair their relationship, and Tom has a decisive influence on a big match after having initially decided not to play as he fears disappointing his father. The film closes with Alice and Joe holding hands and Tom developing an ever closer friendship with Alice's daughter. Le Fils à Joe, therefore, is a film which celebrates heritage, tradition and family via a focus on rugby and rural life. And this is quite in keeping with some examples of what have been termed the sepia cinema that emerged during the Sarkozy presidency of 2007 to 2012 in France. The fictional village of Dumiac that we see in the film is one that appears not to have changed much over the years. Its community is certainly not ethnically or racially diverse. Jonah Tukalo, the New Zealander who coaches the Tom's rugby team and who we can see near the, I think the third from the left in the slides, on the right-hand picture in this current slide, is an ethnic minority outsider who is quickly accepted in the village. He's of Maori heritage. However, his presence is temporary, and his status as a privileged and celebrated outsider is tempered by the fact that he lives in a caravan near the rugby pitch. In the rugby match that we see near the end of the film, the winning try is scored by a somewhat overweight child of North African descent who is known as Bouboul, who is a rare ethnic minority figure in the village. Whilst the outcome could be read as a symbol of hope and assimilation, the fact that Bouboul is referred to as the Maori by Joe turns him into a sort of exoticized other and renders his otherness less problematic from a French perspective by obscuring its connection to the legacies of French colonialism in North Africa. So now I'm going to move on to looking at the second main film for this evening, La Dream Team, a film comedy by Thomas Soriot from 2016. The Dream Team is much more of a comedy than Le Fils à Joe. Le Dream Team is a comedy about a wayward Paris Saint-Germain striker, again, fictional player, named Maxime Belloc, whose career is on a downward trajectory due to a combination of injuries and discipline. Belloc returns to his native Berry area in central France to take charge of a struggling junior team whilst recovering from a largely self-inflicted injury that stems from his own ill discipline. By locating this story in central France, what we see here is in some ways the opposite of Le Fils à Joe. Le Fils à Joe takes place in France's rugby heartland, whereas central France, the Berry region, is something of a footballing and sporting backwater in France. You probably need to know quite a bit about French sport to have heard of the only football team from the area, La Berrichonne de Châteauroux, hardly a giant of French footballing history. Nevertheless, the sports field constitutes an important focus for community in both films. And again, in La Dream Team, we see a focus on family and tradition emerging in this context as a fallen idol seeks to repair family relationships. Near the start, Maxime Belloc is told by his father, who's played by Gérard Depardieu, that he has become an idiot and that he's no longer welcome at the family home. On the advice of his agent, Maxime treats the coaching role of a junior side that he takes on in the village as a means of seeking to repair his image. We see him settling into a deck chair and becoming engrossed in his smartphone during one of the initial training sessions that he is notionally supposed to be overseeing. He does, however, embark on something of a similar mission to that of Joe in Le Fils à Joe by seeking to turn round his failing junior team following a 9-0 defeat to a local rival. Now, whereas Le Fils à Joe is a film that largely celebrates rugby and rugby culture, La Dream Team more frequently mocks football culture. Maxime Belloc is frequently shown to be inarticulate, lack the tactical knowledge one might expect of a top-level player, and he struggles to speak without resorting to cliches. Near the start of the film, we hear Maxime take a phone call from French national football team boss Didier Deschamps, although the voice of Deschamps is that of an impersonator who exaggerates the coach's Basque accent. We also hear Maxime's agent mock the standard of French spoken by former international player Franck Ribéry, and Maxime's dad has a flatulent dog known as Platini, named after the famous footballer Michel Platini. However, La Dream Team also seeks to establish connections between its obviously fictional narrative and the real world via press cuttings of Maxime Belloc's career. Maxime wants to recover from injury and restore his image in order to be included in France's 2016 European Championship squad, and there's footage alongside real players from Paris Saint-Germain at the time. Thomas Soriot's film in many ways conflates two competing narratives associated with France's 1998 World Cup victory via its focus on the sort of racially diverse Black Blanc Beurre team that Phil mentioned in his paper this evening. So it kind of conflates the focus on this racial diversity of the Les Bleus, France's 1998 Football World Cup champions, and also this mixture of rural and regional identities that were in the 1998 team as well. As leading scholars in French sports, such as Yvon Gastaut, has observed, France's 1998 World Cup triumph can be read as a symbol of tradition as well as modernity when you put together these two perspectives. Now, when it comes to race in the film, Maxime is accused of racism by a black teenager in the team for calling him Mamadou, although the player actually turns out to be playing a joke and indeed be called Mamadou. Nevertheless, the fact that Maxime regularly refers to a player of East Asian descent whose dad owns the local Chinese restaurant as Tsing Tao, which is a name of a Chinese brand of beer, is not problematized in any manner. The themes of education, love, and fitting in create a further connection between La Dream Team and Le Fils à Joe. Maxime offers to provide after-school tuition to his star player Martin after his mother Alice, to whom Maxime is attracted, stops him from attending due to his grades at school declining. As the film reaches its conclusion, the overweight reserve goalkeeper, who Maxime had previously told to go away and play chess, becomes an unlikely hero as he saves a penalty that secures a cup final victory against local rivals that had earlier defeated Maxime's team 9-0 at the start of the film. Maxime goes back on his early notion that winning is everything, telling his players it's not the destination that counts, it's the journey. After the victory, Maxime embraces Alice, and Maxime's niece and team helper Lily kisses star player Martin. This mirrors the way in which we saw a sort of pair of kind of romances, potential romances or friendships developing at the end of Le Fils à Joe, the romance between Joe and Alice, and the burgeoning friendship between their children, Tom and Fanny. However, the Dream Team doesn't end with the underdog triumph of Maxime's protégés in a rural location. Maxime returns to Paris Saint-Germain, having recovered from his injury, signs a new deal after his agent had tried to sell him to an Italian club despite his desire to remain with the French champions. As the credits roll, we see Maxime Belloc in the tunnel at the Parc des Princes alongside real-life PSG stars. Thus, his time in the Berry area appears to be in a rural interlude that permits his return to the much more urban and flashy world of professional football. Now, in drawing some conclusions today, what I'd like to do is touch upon the evolving focus on masculinity in French sports films in the last decade or so, because I would argue that as a whole, they are going slightly further than focusing on some of the macho stereotypes associated with the sports film genre. We see struggles of protagonists that are located both within and outside a sporting context. These involve men who are fathers in either biological terms or who act as surrogate fathers, who seek to reconnect or connect in some way with children via sport, or at least regain a sense of family, community, and connection via sport. In such films, we see men form bonds within a sporting context despite differences in age, social class, outlook on life, and sexuality. In Niels Tavernier's 2013 film De Toutes Nos Forces, known in English as The Finishers, a somewhat uninvolved father bonds with his tetraplegic teenage son by training for an Ironman triathlon together with him in Nice. In another film that I've put a picture of on this slide, Archinard and Prévost-Légonis' Monsieur Je sais tout, literally meaning Mr. I Know Everything, we see a football coach develop an unlikely bond with his autistic teenage nephew. In Valérie Le Basque's 2018 film Chacun pour tous, we see a coach of a basketball team for players with learning difficulties seek to boost their chances in the Olympics by incorporating several players who do not have learning difficulties. Despite this morally problematic premise, the film portrays a moving story of the interaction and bonds between the two different categories of players in the squad. Unlikely combinations of individuals also feature in Cédric Le Gallo and Maxime Gauvard's 2019 comedy Les Crevettes Pailletées, known as The Shiny Shrimps in English, which sees a macho swimmer who is disciplined for a homophobic remark forced to seek redemption by helping a gay men's water polo team called the Shiny Shrimps compete in the World Gay Games. Now, within these aforementioned films, we often see men acting as father figures or leaders to individuals or teams. And now these teams are almost exclusively composed of boys or men rather than girls or women. Although there have been several recent French sports films that have focused on women's sports teams, this has generally appeared somewhat tokenistic, and the teams often constitute a means to an end within the context of the film's narrative. In Julien Allard's 2018 comedy Comme des Garçons, known in English as Let the Girls Play, a macho journalist organises a women's football match in order to win a bet with his boss. In Mohamed Hamidi's 2020 comedy Une Belle Équipe, Kad Merad plays a football coach who fields an all-female team in his men's last 3 matches of the season in order to enable the club to complete their season and avoid relegation. So to just round off quickly, the at times problematic and tokenistic approaches to issues such as gender, sexuality, and handicap in some of the films that I've just mentioned mirrors the way in which Le Fils à Joe and Le Dream Team deal with issues surrounding race and ethnicity in a similarly problematic manner. Nevertheless, these films also collectively point towards an increasing, if not unproblematic, focus on inclusivity and social integration in French sports films. Crucially, they also symbolize a new form of focus on masculinity that is increasingly based on vulnerability rather than conforming to some of the macho stereotypes often associated with sports films. Okay, thank you for listening, everyone. I'm going to finish there.
Thanks, Jonathan. Great timing. And we have a question from Sean, so I'll hand over to Sean.
Thanks, Jonathan. Really fascinating paper, and I'm actually, I've just edited a collection on sports film and national culture, and one of the things that we talk about there is that often sports cinema is something that's quite national, and the films you describe, and this is why paper like yours is so interesting to me, is that a lot of these films don't travel beyond France. So it's fascinating to hear of the presence of sports cinema, and you know, clearly it has an important presence in contemporary French cinema. I was interested though, and I'd agree entirely, because what I have looked at in terms of French cinema more generally is that I get the sense, as you seem to agree, that sport is less present more generally in French cinema, that when compared relative, say, its presence in, say, British cinema or indeed in Spanish cinema, for example. So I'm interested in your kind of thoughts on why that might be. Why has sport not had the, given how prominent sport is in French society, in French life?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point. On one hand, some of the early silent films, like you said in your book, we do see elements of sport. However, the focus is often, when we look at early silent films, on the individual rather than the sports event or the sports team. Jean Vigo's 1920s film about the swimmer Jean Taris would be a prime example. I think that the relative lack of sport within French cinema is in some ways symptomatic of maybe the sports relationship with intellectual life in France as a whole. I think that among French intellectuals, there's a certain degree of cynicism about French sport, the point of it, the value of it. I mean, to a certain extent, this has changed since the 1998 Football World Cup in France. I think there are various paradoxes or tensions or contradictions within it all, because France as a nation, I think, gets very engrossed in certain types of events that are linked to a quest that is maybe linked to the nation itself, what it means, and the meaningfulness of the Tour de France cycle race or the Vendée Globe, yachting, and things like this are things that almost the sort of sense of mythology and tradition that goes with that, it seems like from a French perspective, is not something that certain types of people in France think can be associated with a very commercial form of professional sport. And I think there's a more long-standing radical critique of French sport from a sort of radical left-wing perspective. And I think that within the televisual landscape, sport hasn't been as big within the history of French television as it has been in the history of television in, say, Britain and Ireland. Indeed, there was very little live football, barring international team matches and the French Cup final on French television, or even highlights, before the arrival of Canal Plus in the early to mid-1980s. So I think French cinema is maybe replicating something we see in French intellectual life and French televisual landscape through its relative lack of focus on sport.
Seems to be increasing, though, from what you're saying there. There seems to be, perhaps reflecting the increased presence of sport in the broader media landscape, that film is now beginning to catch up slowly in terms of featuring sport a little more.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think it's particularly significant that we're seeing more films about a sport such as football, because you could almost argue that a slight counterexample to what I said about sport not being all that present within French cinema is there have been a number of films over the years focusing on cycling in a variety of different ways, kind of celebrating cycling. But yeah, I think France is maybe embracing commercial aspects of sport, and maybe in some level, maybe not getting as hung up about it as it used to, perhaps.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that, John. I see there's another question in there, but thank you. Fascinating paper.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, we have a question from Phil. So hand back to Phil, and then we're going to move on to the third presentation. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm just wondering there, Jonathan, thanks very much. I really enjoyed that. I was very struck by your mention of Taris. And I mean, that film is almost the last thing it's about is swimming, isn't it? It's an absolutely stunning piece. And I was just wondering whether there's anything you might identify, in more modern films that's got any kind of formal innovation which you might compare with it. Possibly the Zidane film, the big documentary.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting point, because just for people who maybe aren't familiar with the work of Jean Vigo, made 4 films during a career cut short due to ill health. Only one of them feature-length film. Jean Vigo's Taris, if you go on YouTube, I think you can watch it in full. It's a very experimental film. Jean Vigo was influenced by anarchism and surrealism, and it is quite an experimental film. We see slow motion footage that's played backwards and so on. Within the types of sports films that I was talking about from the last decade, and the film about Zidane that you mentioned is slightly older than that. I think it's roughly 15 years old now. The sorts of films I was focusing on today, I deliberately decided to focus on what I think would be fair to call mainstream commercial films, which are kind of either sort of mainstream comedies or kind of fairly mainstream, almost like sort of nostalgic, almost heritage films, maybe going a bit far. In terms of things that kind of more artistic end of the spectrum, I mean, there is a diversity in terms of types of films. I think that the film about Zidane that you mentioned that came out in 2005, and it's basically, for people who are not aware of it, lots of cameras, like 20 or 30 cameras were trained on Zidane during the Spanish match when he was playing for Real Madrid. So lots of slow-mo, very artistically filmed footage as we hear him reflecting on football. And like you say, it's about Zidane, the sort of mythologized figure, rather than watching him score goals and so on. And actually in the match in question, during which he's filmed by all these different cameras, he's actually sent off towards the end of the game. I don't think we even see that in the film. What I would say with the Zidane film, when it comes to situating it, is it's very much a film about French sport and a French sporting icon. However, calling it a French film on certain levels is perhaps problematic in that, if I remember correctly, it's by a non-French director who nevertheless seeks to celebrate Zidane and his star status and his sort of artistry, creative genius, which in some ways is something in common with what Jean Vigo's doing with Jean Taris in his much earlier film.
Great, thanks very much.
Okay, thanks again, Jonathan. So virtual round of applause for Jonathan, and we'll move on to our third and final speaker, David Forrest. So David, if you'd like to unmute yourself and turn your video on. David is Senior Lecturer in Film Studies and Faculty Director of Learning and Teaching at the University of Sheffield. He's the author of New Realism's Contemporary British Cinema, co-author of Barry Hines' Kes, Threads and Beyond, and co-editor of Social Class and Television Drama in Contemporary Britain and Filmurbia, Screening the Suburbs. He's currently co-investigator on the HRC-funded project Beyond the Multiplex, Audiences for Specialised Film in English Regions, and on the Research England OFS-funded project Transforming and Activating Places, Enhancing Equality, Diversity and Inclusion in Interdisciplinary Placemaking. And his paper tonight is titled Barry Hines and the Lost Football Film. David, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. So Barry Hines was a novelist, a screenwriter who's probably best known for two seminal pieces of post-war British culture. Kes, which is the film of his novel A Cache for a Knave, directed by Ken Loach in 1969, and Threads, which was the BAFTA award-winning BBC play of 1984, which in unsparing detail imagined the brutal consequences of a nuclear war from the perspectives of two Sheffield families. Hines was a fiercely working-class writer who remained rooted to his South Yorkshire community throughout his life. His writing was shaped by direct lived experience, and football in particular was a recurring theme of his work. His first novel, The Blinder, about a prodigiously talented and academically gifted schoolboy footballer, and three of his TV plays, 1976's Two Men from Derby, 1990's Shooting Stars, 1991's Born Kicking, all had the sport at their heart. In addition to these published and broadcast works, Hines' archive, which is housed at the University of Sheffield, reveals a number of other football stories that, for various reasons, failed to come to fruition. And part of the focus of the talk this evening will be on one of those lost works, the Injury Time Project. So Heinz's football stories share a number of characteristics. Nearly all are set in the north of England. All focus on highly articulate working class protagonists who are, to some extent, divided by education and football. They are defined as mavericks, favouring expressive, attacking football, and they're often pitted against coaches and authority figures more broadly, who seek to instill mechanistic, overly pragmatic tactics. All are politically articulate, and they see professional football in class terms as, at its worst, a tool of exploitation and dehumanisation. They all have deep class-based and geographical connections to the clubs that they play for, principles which are compromised or exploited by the ruthless chairman they come up against. And the narratives frequently probe the limitations of hypermasculinity, while all being concerned with football as an art form and as a site of agency and expression for the working class. So the origins of Heinz's political engagement with football are to be found in his childhood, where he excelled in the field of athletics and football and cricket at Ecclesfield Grammar School in Sheffield. He played for the Barnsley Football Club A team. He had trials for Manchester United, and he represented England grammar school boys. His brief career in international football, however, was critical in shaping his firmly held conviction of the sport as a mechanism of class politics in England, as this extract from a 1975 Times educational supplement piece in which he reflected on his middle-class teammates in the England under-15s team shows. They were so articulate and so assured. They had a collective air of massive superiority that staggered me. And suddenly I didn't want to talk. I was embarrassed by my clothes. They tolerated me. After all, they were all too well bred to be rude, but all the time I felt I was being politely patronised. The only place I could match them was on the football pitch. I didn't have much to say there. I didn't have to say very much there. Some of them were good players, but even the best lacked the urgency and determination of the working class grammar school boys. But then, what had they to be urgent about? Football was not important in their lives. For them, it really was a game. We played Scotland at Celtic Park. I can't remember much about the match except the score. We lost 0-3. It didn't seem all that important though. What had been much more valuable was a political experience, seeing the class system at work close up. For the first time, I'd been able to place football into some kind of social perspective. As Heinz's hopes of a professional career faded, he moved to Loughborough to train as a PE teacher. Among his contemporaries in the Loughborough football team were former Crewe Alexandra manager Darry O'Grady, former England youth coach Ted Powell, and ex-Arsenal and Scotland keeper Bob Wilson. They were coached by Alan Wade, who penned the hugely influential FA Guide to Coaching, which broke new ground in its application of theory. And against this backdrop, Heinz's athletic prowess was met by a renewed academic curiosity. Heinz had described studying English literature at grammar school as an imposition by middle-class teachers in a middle-class institution glorifying upper-class values. Rather than, quote, reading books about people who've been dead for hundreds of years, unquote, that were about, quote, the difficulties getting your daughter married off to a rich young buck, unquote. Heinz favoured comics like The Tough of the Track, whose Alf Tupper, a welder and 4-minute miler who was fueled by fish and chips, was his childhood hero. But when he was bored one Sunday afternoon at Loughborough, he borrowed his roommate's copy of Orwell's Animal Farm, which he described as reading in a sitting. He was hooked, and he began writing for the college newspaper. And then a few years later, managed to persuade his course tutors to allow him to submit his dissertation as an extended piece of creative writing. So this was in 1964. The piece was called The Flight of the Hawk, perhaps anticipating his most famous work. It concerns Jack Barlow, an intellectual and athletically talented schoolboy torn between the worlds of academia and football. Through the course of the narrative, he develops an aesthetic appreciation of the game and comes to see sport as a mode of artistic performance. Hines writes the football sequences in meticulous lyrical detail, establishing a register of poetic realism that would go on to mature 4 years later with A Kestrel for a Knave. And the dissertation's introduction contains within it a kind of manifesto for Hines's football writing. I'm deeply concerned and interested in the relationship between the physical and mental sides of man, believing that the two are equally important for the full development of personality. Too often, I see a deep rift between these two aspects. They are forced apart into opposing factions by ignorant, prejudiced people who will not believe in their integration. The growth of aesthetic appreciation to me is vitally important, and I feel that if physical education can awaken the appreciation of the arts, then it has performed a task which is of equal importance, if not greater, than many of its more boosted byproducts. So the dissertation was expanded and adapted a few years later as 1966's novel The Blinder, which I've already mentioned, and that was a novel that sparked Tony Garnett, the producer's interest, which in turn led to the Kes project of 1969. And by the mid-1970s, Hines was a very prominent screenwriter. He continued to work with Ken Loach and had 3 of his plays broadcast on the BBC's Play for Today strand. It was this visibility and prominence that attracted Scott Marshall, a London-based talent agent, and one of his clients, Christopher King, who was a young television director, to approach Hines about a new project, a film about an English footballer playing in the ever-expanding North American Soccer League. Marshall and King had observed the booming interest in soccer following the World Entertainment-backed New York Cosmos' acquisition of Pelé in 1975, and used this as the inspiration for the project. Marshall had won seed corn financing from the BBC and used this to secure Hines as a screenwriter in 1977. But just a year after, in 78, Hines had left the project, having delivered what was deemed to be an unviable script. So I want to spend what remains of the talk discussing the failure of this project, because I think it reveals a great deal about Hines's unerring commitment to a particular idea of football. So the commercial rationale for this project was obvious. The football industry was in receipt of substantial investment and growth in the USA, and given that many of the teams were backed by entertainment companies, a feature film tie-in seemed to be logical. In early 1977, Marshall and King had held positive talks with Rod Stewart, who expressed an interest in playing the footballer in the film. And then they subsequently outlined their plans for financing in a letter to Hines, which I've seen in the archive. So it says, "Our present plan, when the screenplay is completed and a contractual arrangement has been reached with Rod Stewart, is to approach Warner Brothers, whose interest will be twofold. Warner Brothers Records released Rod Stewart's record in the States. Warner Brothers' parent company, Warner Communication, owns the Cosmos, for whom Pelé plays, and they've heavily invested in establishing professional soccer in the United States." So the producers were relying on the increasing commercialization of the North American Soccer League, and Stewart was their bankable asset, their way in to that industry. However, as the financing process for the film wore on, the expansion of the league was failing to grow in line with the huge investment that it had received. Audiences were static until 1981 and then dropped rapidly as franchises folded and the broadcasters cut their losses. And ultimately then, the film project fell victim to what was a highly volatile commercial climate. It was conceived to capitalise on a hoped-for convergence between Hollywood and the heritage and global reach of football. And so the film was, I think, always acutely susceptible to the same market forces that kind of generated that ecology. So in helping him to prepare for the screenplay, Scott Marshall had sent Hines a range of articles that were kind of commenting on and detailing the rise of soccer in America. Many provide further economic justifications for the project. For example, Hines read a piece in the New York magazine that compared the New York Cosmos to Warner's other prized assets, such as The Exorcist, Frank Sinatra, rock groups like the Rolling Stones, electronic pinball, Bugs Bunny, Superman, cable television. Very much an asset-driven vision of football as a sport and as a product. Another prophetically suggested the limitations of the sport's repositioning as an entertainment product, with Cosmos director Jay Emmett in this article lamenting the fact that we can't control soccer like our other businesses. Marshall also provided his screenwriter with articles identifying a trend of successful sports films which had emerged in the wake of Rocky, hoping that Hines would be inspired to write a similarly unambiguous underdog sporting story. But Hines firmly rejected the established trends of the sports film. There was no uplifting narrative of redemption in injury time. Instead, Hines's vision for the project was bound inextricably to his own relationship with football and his political values as a writer. So the archive shows that the personal networks that Hines had developed at Loughborough were fruitful for his research on the project. He'd asked his old coach, Alan Wade, to contact Rodney Marsh on his behalf in order to set up a meeting between Marsh, Barry Hines, and George Best. Wade had assured Marsh that Hines was a serious author and not a journalist, and that he was also a fair footballer. And while it's not clear that the meeting took place, it's obvious that Hines drew a great deal of inspiration from both Marsh and Best for the play. Like those footballers, Tom Quinn, the protagonist of Injury Time, is a miraculously gifted but highly undisciplined playmaker. He begins his career at his home club, which is referred to as Town, but resembles Barnsley Football Club, Hines' own local club, before being sold to City, actually named as Leeds United in Hines' early drafts. At City, Tom is unable to adapt to his manager Vickers, whose traditional safety-first approach to the game is at odds with Tom's philosophy, which he describes as safety last and win with a bit of style. Tom is dropped, his marriage breaks down, he sinks into alcoholism, and it's that leads him to flee England for America. So Hines positions Tom not as the plucky everyman, but as a highly depressed and jaded individual. His move to the US is not about self-discovery and frontier building, but about exile and desperation. And that's reflected, I think, by the film's very fragmented temporal structure, which skips between Tom's early life in the north of England, his rise and fall in the English leagues, and his vapid experience of America. Rather than football's answer to Rocky, Hines instead imagined a complex art film that sought to critique sport's intimate relationship with capitalism. Just as in Hines' other football stories, and in line with his own career, on-pitch creativity is matched by intellectual curiosity and political articulacy off it. Tom's outspokenness and his willingness to challenge authority is interpreted as a sign of uncharacteristic and dangerous intelligence for a footballer. Towards the end of his time at the club, Tom gives an indiscreet interview to a reporter. This is when he's playing for the City in England, which results in a fiery exchange with his manager, Vickers. Tom says, "I didn't shoot my mouth off. I expressed my own thoughts on what I thought was wrong with the game." Vickers says, "Fuck your thoughts. Who do you think you are? Chairman Mao will do the thinking here, me and Johnny and the coaching staff." So here Hines is explicitly positioning the thinking Tom against an establishment that seeks to regulate its dissenters at every opportunity. Vickers' Maoist slur results from Tom's consistent questioning of the capitalist authority that he comes up against. At one point suggesting that the directors should stick to selling scrap metal and pork pies. After all, all they're after is success at any price. Tom's self-awareness of his status as a commodity is accelerated when he moves to the US, with Hines using the game's naked embrace of the entertainment industry to form a binary between football as art and football as commodity. When Tom's asked to wear a uniform during a pre-match meet and greet exercise with fans, he responds that he is a footballer, not a tailor's dummy. He complains to his new partner, "I don't like having to sell myself all the time. I'm a footballer, not a salesman." Moreover, while Tom is critical of the small-time businessmen who run football in Britain, he's even more sceptical of Al, the man who owns his American team. He says, "Al doesn't love the game. He doesn't even understand it properly. He understands selling though, and if he can sell the club to the public, he'll stick with it. If he can't, he'll bail out. It's as simple as that." As Gary Wannell has argued, the conventional sports film relies on sport's implicit narrative structure, the rule-governed contest which results in a winner. Hines defies this convention in two ways. Firstly, he disrupts the linear expectation of a showdown, which might enable the hero to achieve some kind of long sought for success and redemption. In contrast, Hines's fragmented temporal approach works to consciously deny suspense and maintains a focus on the game not as a mechanism of narrative, but as an object of philosophical reflection. And secondly, by centering the film on a sporting protagonist for whom winning is not everything, Tom frequently asserts a principled approach to sport, which is rooted in place-specific values of solidarity, reciprocity, and a footballing aesthetics of resistance and spectacle. So to return to Wannell's argument, the inherent narrativity of competitive individualism, which makes sport and sports films a metaphor for lived experience under capitalism, is actively worked against in Hines's vision of the footballing film. For Hines, the game functions in multiple and sometimes contradictory ways. It's a site of mobility, but also displacement, affirmation of long-held values of solidarity and resistance to market forces. It's a site of individual expression and performance. It's a working-class art form that might offer resources of autonomy and resistance against a mass culture that for Hines was already alienating and dividing its constituents. Hines died of Alzheimer's in 2016, but his love for the game had faded over the years before he became unwell. But to finish this paper on a note of hope, in what was probably Hines's last substantial writing project before the disease began to take effect, he had returned to football. He'd written a novel, Springwood Stars, which is about a young working class footballer who escapes the depression-hit Yorkshire of the late 1920s to play for Herbert Chapman's great Arsenal side. And this refers back to many of the themes that I've discussed this evening. And for the last 20 years, it's been gathering dust, first in a box in Hines's Barnsley home, and then in the special collections at my university in Sheffield. But thankfully, in 2021, it will be published for the first time. I think I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thanks, David. I must admit, I was expecting Brian Glover to pop up at some point, and not Rod Stewart. And I cannot get that image out of my head, but hopefully other people have, and I've got a question for you. Any questions? Sean, I think you've come up with a question. Yeah, Sean, over to you.
Oh, sorry. Thanks, David. Another fascinating, this has been a really fascinating session. All the papers have been excellent. And this year's included in terms of this. I have to admit, I wasn't familiar with the existence of this potential film that you've described. It sounds fascinating. I'm interested in, it sounds to me very reminiscent of the British kind of social realist films of the 1960s. I'm thinking in particular Loneliness, The Long Distance Runner, and This Sporting Life. Even the use of Tom as the name of the lead protagonist, is that a reference to Tom Courtney perhaps in Loneliness, and the criticism of capitalism? Is there any evidence that he was informed by, influenced by, in some way responding to that tradition in the screenplay he was writing?
Yeah, I think first of all, the point about Tom Quinn, the central character, and the connection there is well, he was originally going to be called Tom Kite, but he realised that Tom Kite was a golfer, and so had to change it to Tom Quinn. So I'm not sure if there's a connection there to Courtney, but he was a big fan of Sillitoe. He read Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner, because in his BBC Play for Today speech day, which is set in a school in Sheffield, the kids are actually reading Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner. So there's clearly that kind of intertextual connection there. I think Alf Tupper is also a character that Sillitoe was really interested as well in, as a kind of prototype for the class-conscious working class sportsman. And there's definite connections between Tough of the Track and Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner. I think the relationship with Story is really, really interesting as well. I was thinking, when I was putting this paper together, of Arthur Machen in This Sporting Life, and Frank in the novel, and he talks about being a great ape on the football field, and his own realization of his status as a kind of economic instrument, and his disputes with the chairman of the club, obviously Wakefield Trinity. And I think what's interesting is that the class background of David Story and Barry Hines was very, very similar. And what was also similar is that they both had that kind of returning native anxiety around them. Both went to university, or in Story's case, went to the Slade School of Art, and while also maintaining a working class identity, which was grounded in sport. You know, for Story, he was a professional. He played rugby league, and Hines obviously played football to a high standard. I think Hines had a happier coexistence was able to reconcile sport and writing, and that was obviously the concern of Flight of the Hawk. I think for Story, it was a much more anxiety provoking convergence, that he didn't seem to be able to kind of combine his experience of his body, his athletic body, and his kind of intellectual or cerebral pursuits, and that was obviously a tension for both of them. So I'm not sure of the relationship between the two, but I do know that Hines read This Sporting Life and was interested in it. I think he was more directly influenced by Sillitoe, but certainly operates within that ecosystem. Now, the point of difference is that Hines never really left Yorkshire, whereas Story did, and Sillitoe kind of did have a bit more of a divergent relationship with Nottingham. Hines really was rooted in South Yorkshire, and so we never really got to see him kind of explore those geographical tensions and social tensions that we see in Story's work. But yeah, sport absolutely recurs throughout in the same way that it does with Story, and I think the connection there is that both were extremely talented sportsmen as well as being writers.
I'm just one very quick follow-up question on that. I mean, I'm struck by, it departs so much from that kind of dominant American model of the sports film in terms of its concerns and its trajectory. I would have thought someone like Ken Loach, something like this might appeal to. I mean, I don't know if that's now that it's been published, perhaps, or I mean, there's the possibility there that it might be adapted at some point or reworked in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are potential connections there. One of the tragedies is that Loach was working with Hines in the early 2000s on a part adaptation of his novel The Heart of It, which is about the miners' strike. And there's some correspondence between 16 Films, Loach's production company, and Hines. And unfortunately, what you can see in the correspondence is the deterioration that Hines was experiencing at the time. So I know that Loach was interested in the fact that we'd unearthed some of Hines's writing on the miners' strike, and we did a production of it last year, and Tony Garnett was also aware of that before he died. So there is a connection there, and there is a lot of interest in the archive, and other writers and directors have been interested. Warp Films were interested as well in the miners' strike stuff. So I think there is a potential for a kind of reanimation of these works, and that's certainly what's happened with Springwood Stars, that when we put on the miners' strike work and other stories, which are an excellent publisher, mainly published work in translation, actually came along because they're based in Sheffield and were really interested in the work and wanted to look into the archive and talk to us about this novel. So I think there is that potential there. And indeed, interestingly, Scott Marshall, the producer, had approached Hines because of Kes and because of The Gamekeeper, which Hines made with Ken Loach as well, which is a kind of very underrated TV film of 1975. So yeah, it's strange because what Marshall wanted was a highly commercial film, but what attracted him to Hines was that sensible authenticity and that eye for realism. When I spoke to Marshall on the phone when we were writing the book, he was really in no doubt that Hines was a brilliant writer. I think what he'd misunderstood was that Hines really wasn't a pragmatist at all, and that's obviously what attracted Hines to Loach, that kind of shared political commitment.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks. Alan's got a question for David, and then of course he's got one for Phil as well. So Alan, I'll just hand over to you.
Oh, sure. Thank you to all the panelists for the papers, very enjoyable. Yeah, I was just struck, David, that you were saying at the end there that he kind of fell out of love with the game, Hines, which doesn't surprise me. And I was just wondering if any of his later football works attempted to grapple with the transitions in certainly English football, in the Premier League era in the 90s and so on. Or did he kind of stick to more historical material and avoid the sort of commercialisation of football with the barge pole?
So 1990, he wrote Shooting Stars, and in 1991, Born Kicking. Shooting Stars was broadcast on Channel 4, and Born Kicking was broadcast on Screen 2 Strand, which was a kind of follow-on from the Play for Today. Both of them actually deal with exactly that increasing commercialisation. So Shooting Stars is about a Man City player who is kidnapped and held to ransom when he's on the verge of signing for Hamburg from Manchester City. So again, it's kind of interesting in that it deals with very much in a very explicit and quite heavy-handed way footballers' kind of status as commodity. Born Kicking is a bit more subtle. It was actually produced by Tony Garnett. It's about a woman footballer who breaks into a men's team, which is, it's basically, it's QPR, so it's filmed at Loftus Road. It's not called that. They're called I can't remember what they're called actually, but yeah, they're not called QPR, but it is QPR, and it's highly authentic in terms of its representation of football scenes, apart from the actual scenes involving the central actor who couldn't play football, unfortunately. But it is fascinating in what it looks at, not just in terms of gender and anticipating some of the debates that we see now in football, but very much in terms of this kind of tension between the footballer's talent, the central character's talent, her assets as a footballer, and the extent to which she deserves her place within the men's team, and then the chairman who is seeking to exploit her on the basis that she is a marketable asset. So one thinks of the chairman of Perugia, I think it was, in Italy in the early 2000s, who was trying to recruit women footballers. So there was a strangely prophetic undercurrent to a lot of Hines' work, and he absolutely was aware of that increasing commercialisation. And yeah, as I say, we do know that towards the end of his career, he was really falling out of love. He'd stopped, although he got to see Barnsley promoted to the Premier League, which we're told was something that was really important to him, because of the way that came out of Barnsley being in such a kind of economic and collectively kind of mental depression, really, in the wake of the miners' strike. So yeah, and Springwood Stars, just to finish off, is historical, but is very much grounded in the kind of class dynamics of the northern working class, and looks back to the general strike and the kind of depression, and looks at football as a mechanism of hope and resistance against that. So I think it absolutely is in the present tense, really, in that it kind of it critiques quite a superficial idea of football as Hines saw it in the Premiership. Contrast that with the values that he saw embodied in someone like Herbert Chapman. Yeah.
I've just been really interested if he'd have done a take on like a footballer of the Premier League age, like, I don't know, someone local, like a James Milner. It's just been fascinating to see him meditate on players who grew up in, frankly, very different circumstances to the ones he grew up in as a player. And he just would have brought something very interesting to that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think we took a colleague of mine from When Saturday Comes, Ewan Flynn, who did a piece for When Saturday Comes, interviewed Bob Wilson about Hines for a great piece, and he was saying that actually at Loughborough there was a real mixture of backgrounds. The people who were there, the players, many of them went on to be professional, but obviously they were there to also study and to engage with ideas. So it was a real melting pot of, many of them were grammar school boys, but it was obviously it was a bit of an equaliser in terms of their intellectual development at Loughborough. And so, yeah, they came into contact with each other with a shared knowledge of football, but had quite different economic and social backgrounds. And I think, yeah, that Loughborough was really important in challenging some of Hines's perceptions of the quite rigid associations of class and football that he had, and that were evident in that Times educational supplement piece from 1975.
We're running a bit short of time now. So, Alan, can I get you to ask your...
Oh, yeah, my question to Phil quickly was just to kind of place in the dialogue whether you think the experiences between Benazzi, who you described in the paper, and Zinedine Zidane are whether they're comparable or contrasting figures, because it struck me there's some interesting connections that could be made.
That's great. That's fascinating, actually. I don't seem to be able to put the video on, Martin, for some reason, but apologies for that. It's every time I try to do it, it says, yeah, I need to get permission, but it's just not. If you can hear me okay, then that's the main thing. Thanks, Alan. I've just actually was going to kick off with a kind of footnote to David's fascinating paper, and particularly to the point where you were mentioning Alan Sillitoe, and I was very struck actually by Sillitoe's writing on North Africa, on France in North Africa, particularly in the Bill Posters trilogy, and A Tree on Fire in particular, which is, I don't think, I mean, perhaps it is widely known, but I must say, I mean, I've read a huge amount on Algeria over the years, and I hadn't come across it until, fairly late in the day. So that's a fascinating piece. For if people haven't come across it, just recommend that. And thank you for that paper. And thanks again, Alan, for the question. I'm inclined to think that there's a significant difference in that Benazzi, as a Moroccan, has a very different status, actually. He's sort of somebody he played for Morocco as a junior player. He was qualified for the World Cup from Morocco, and he was naturalized, with remarkable speed to enable him to play for France in the World Cup. So he's kind of almost like an outsider who becomes one of us, who's taken in, but is very much one individual, and he's already within the rugby tradition, if you like, and is accepted eventually into the Southwest and into the national side. So that's kind of one aspect of it. I mean, certainly, the problematic nature of Algeria and the memory of Algeria in France is I think quite different from both the colonial experience of the relationship with Morocco and specifically the decolonization of Morocco. Quite unlike, I mean, there was some violence, but quite unlike the Algerian War and everything which goes with it. So I think that's hugely significant. I think there's also, I mean, obviously rugby and football in themselves are very different constituencies and different kind of representations. I think there's something with Zidane, which means that Zidane, if you like, is somebody who kind of plugs into a tradition of migrant or kind of migrant heritage footballers in France. Platini's already been mentioned, but Copa, so whether it's Poles or Italians, you sort of generations, if you like, of different players which he kind of maps into or touches into, whereas there's nothing really like that with Benazzi. With rugby, you've got a tradition, and it's actually reflected in Jonathan's piece with the names of the players and so on of Spanish background players like the Herreros, Italians like the Spangueros and this kind of thing. So you've got that, but you hadn't got any kind of tradition of North African rugby connection. So he's very much a one-off. there's also things, I think, just about the nature of the individuals, in that with Zidane, and it's the idea that's been put forward particularly by Hugh Dauncey and Douglas Murray in their piece, on the film, Quiet Contradictions of Celebrity. Zidane can be everything to everybody, or virtually. He's somebody who can have any number of things projected upon him, and he's been very careful in terms of managing what he actually commits to and what he actually says. And his political comments have been fairly limited. I mean, there have been important moments when he's spoken out, when it's Chirac against Le Pen, for example, in the presidential elections, but nothing like somebody like Lilian Thuram, who's obviously far more critical. Benazzi, and I mean, I suppose perhaps the way in which he, in 2006, he can have a sort of state reception with Chirac at the Elysee one week, and then a state visit to Algeria, very, very soon afterwards, if you like. And he's kind of playing, different, if you like. He can have various projections onto him and his persona, and I suppose there is something about a collective endeavour of the type of player and the type of position that Benazzi plays in, as opposed to the individual brilliance of somebody like Zidane, and the kind of unknowability, if you like, of his talent and his kind of almost divine ability to play the game and change the game and change how we think about the game. Whereas Benazzi never had any of that. He was a decent player, but he was a kind of grafter and talented, but it's hard work. Plus, in political terms, and perhaps the last point, he did actually commit to a kind of role in government commissions and in the kind of social side of integration policy and so on, particularly under Chirac. So he kind of put his head above the parapet to that extent. He was somebody who did commit to it, and obviously through that, I mean, he will alienate some people in a way which Zidane has managed not to do. So he's more obviously nailed his colours to the mast of the Republic, if you like, than Zidane did, with that kind of double Algerian French persona, really. In fact, what would you think? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I kind of was thinking exactly what you said. Zidane can be everything to everyone, right? And he's been very measured and occasional in his political outbursts or political speeches, right? Yeah. So Benazzi and Thuram's an interesting one, I suppose.
It is
incomparable as well. Yeah, but no, that's a great answer. Thanks.
No, thank you. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Okay, great. Thank you, Phil. Thanks, Alan, for your questions. I'm going to hand over very briefly to Sean, who's got something he wants to publicise, and then I'll bring things to a close.
Thanks a million, Martin, and thanks to Melanie as well, and to all the speakers. This has been a really wonderful workshop. I just wanted to. I mentioned this briefly before, this a bit of a shameless self-promotion here, but this is a book I've just edited on sport, film and national culture, but we have the launch webinar on Thursday this week, Thursday the 19th at 4 p.m. GMT, for those of you who are, I think, Alan, you might be in Canada, so that's a different time over there, I know. So just to let you know, this is happening this Thursday. The collection itself will have most the contributors will be participating in the webinar, and the collection it kind of grew out of what was a small part of a book that Jonathan referred to that I wrote on sport and film, but in it have a small section on sport, film, and national culture, and that began a kind of curiosity about how film has functioned in various national cultures internationally. So forwarded to a CFP, I was delighted with the response I got. So you have in this studies looking at the way in which sport and film have interacted in the US, which has been the dominant kind of force in terms of sports cinema, but also across Europe. So there's chapters on Belgium, on Italy, on the UK, on Germany, and on Spain, and we also then have there's also a couple of non-European or American examples from Taiwan, New Zealand, Brazil, and Ethiopia. So it has a kind of a broad range. It gives a sense, I think, of the importance of the connection between those forces, both sport and film, in a very broad range of national context. So you're all very welcome to join us on Thursday, 4 o'clock. I'm just going to, here in the chat, I'll give you the link for further information and to register if you can join us on Thursday. And thank you again to Martin and Melanie for letting me say a few words.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, and while we're publicising events, the next workshop, which is the 4th workshop, is in December, and I think it's the 16th of December or thereabouts. But I'll send an email out to everybody who registered for this, so that you can just go and register for the next one if you want to. It has a distinctly French feel, and even more French feel, I think, the next one. So thanks again to Melanie in particular for her help tonight, and especially to our 3 speakers. If you could give them all a virtual round of applause or a smiley face or whatever you can get your hands on. Hopefully we'll see you all again in a few weeks' time. Thanks for your time, thanks for your questions, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Bye.